it is a very strange phenomena that the society in general, right, condemns fighting, or maybe not. We do like the odd fight and whatnot. You see it in the schoolyards and and whatever. But in general, like, people seem to think, oh, it's animalistic. It's like too too outside of our modern world and whatnot. But at the same time, so many people watch it. Um, it's a really strange phenomena why fighting is so popular and at the same time actually condemned by society. Like, for the longest time, for example, MMA was illegal in certain states, and in Australia as well, I think, for a while.
Yeah, I think it only got legalized in Vietnam last year.
Wow.
Last year, yeah, not long at all. But I mean, just to lay the groundwork, then I guess you've got on one hand the fact that it's so obviously loved because, well, people have been doing these fights since, well, people have been fighting for sport since forever. Like, not to put too much of an emphasis on it, but gladiators have been fighting thousands of years ago. Folk wrestling is a form of fighting which every society all around the world has done since forever. People love fighting as an entertainment, and yet, yeah, it gets battered as well by in the press a lot of the time. And despite that, it's one of the those big few sports in America: American football, baseball, basketball, and mixed martial arts.
Yeah, it's so big in America. It's just huge, and I don't know if that's like solely down to the advent of UFC, um, or not.
Well, I think you'd have to
But
give a lot of credit to it, but even longer
mm,
term, boxing has been a colossal sport. British people love boxing. It's such a big
yes,
sport here. Um, Even in Thailand, it's their national sport.
yeah, definitely. I mean, in those, yeah, like if we're talking about Thai boxing, yeah, that's such a huge part of their culture for sure.
And
Um,
you can't dismiss wrestling as a combat sport. It's in the Olympics. Judo's in the Olympics. It's colossal in just about every single society all around the world.
yeah, but I guess when it comes to like judo or wrestling, it's a bit more, well, judo or like taekwondo. Those are, you could think of them as slightly more traditional martial arts. So there's a lot more like idea of respect and tradition, and I'm not sure what other words I'm looking for. I think that's pretty much what I was trying to say.
No,
Um,
I completely agree because there is a difference in perception between martial arts and fighting,
yes,
and boxing almost gets to that kind of weird middle ground
yeah,
because you'd have your kid go and do judo, you'd have your kid go and do taekwondo. They're sort of seen as these honourable pursuits,
yes.
whereas cage fighting has been described as human cockfighting, and it gets slammed. It's not been legalized in a lot of countries for a very long time because it's seen as quite barbaric.
Yeah, I guess it does come down to a lot. A lot of it comes down to the damage that you maybe see in fights. I think maybe like organizations like Pride have also kind of given it a bad name. Like, you watch some of the old Pride fights, man, and people are like, I remember just the most vivid image is me watching as a kid, watching Vanderlei Silva stomp on people's heads in Pride, and I was like, "Holy shit, that's awesome!"
Did that affect you as a child that you carried through
Yeah,
to this
it's
day?
trauma.
Yeah. But the thing is, even though fighting is seen like that, fighting is not actually that high an injury rate sport. Now, fine, the brain damage is higher than other sports, but people get injured.
Well, American football does contribute to that, to brain damage a lot as well.
Yeah, that's true, and to a much lesser extent, things like rugby do, or
Mm,
wakeboarding. And in terms of bad injuries, fighting is actually pretty low on the list. I know people are trying to do it to each other, but in terms of the actual effects, it's lower than you'd think. I think it kind of comes back to the perception issue. It's the fact that
Mm,
fighting is seen as a violent act, whether it's more or less damaging than other sports are. It's seen as more violent, and that's the problem with it.
yeah,
Which is what I find weird about why traditional martial arts are accepted as more normal, because these are traditional martial arts that have been sportified to an extent. They've been made clinical to work in the Olympics. But at the end of the day, a lot of these sports have come out of a necessity to fight and
yeah,
an objective to hurt and damage your opponent.
absolutely.
But despite that, they're not seen in the same way.
Yeah, it's strange how that that has changed. Like or why I don't know if it's because it's seen as like a cultural thing as well. Like it's part of a country's culture, so you're in a way investing in learning a new culture, and that's seen as a more worthy pursuit in a way, than doing something like MMA. Uh, yeah, but I mean, I think it's a cage fighting is just so misunderstood as a sport, um, because a lot of the times, people think of the fighters as just savages, um, who just go in there to smash heads, which partly is true. Maybe someone like Homer Simpson, aka Justin Gaethje, just goes in there to smash heads. But what you have to appreciate is there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into what they do. Um, these guys, although they do put themselves in danger in a way, but as you said, perhaps the injury rate is actually not super high. um, there is a tremendous amount of work, and a lot of them, they know what they're signing up for. They love what they do, truly love what they do.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing that it's called mixed martial arts, and yet it's not seen as martial arts. But it really is.
Yeah,
Look at Wonder Boy. He's clearly a karate fighter and a kickboxer, and he's a mixed martial artist. Look at anyone who does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu who goes into the sport. They're clearly martial artists, but they're
yeah,
fighters. It's a weird thing that they're not seen as it's not seen as martial arts, despite the fact that it's very accurately named mixed martial arts, where you can have all these different disciplines coming in. Well, who was the actress who said martial arts are not the arts at the Oscars or something? Do you remember that?
oh yeah, you're right.
Now I don't remember who it was who said this, but I
Was
think
it fuck,
I think
sorry.
that's kind of the point, that they're not seen as the arts.
No,
In
yeah,
a way they are. They fill their own special niche, but they are martial arts. They are arts, and yet
yeah.
people don't see them that way. It
No, they don't seem to. That's absolutely. I think only people that really see them as arts are people who are invested in it, but not from the side of, oh, I like seeing knockouts and blood and just want to do. I want to see the gladiator part of it. I'm like people like us, and maybe people who train. Usually, they see the art in it, because I do. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think there's absolute art in what the guys do. Just in like even just the movements, there's an art to it. Yeah,
Yeah, well, that brings us
it's
on to like one of the main reasons it gets loved, because sports in general can be loved for the discipline and the control that people who practice them show, which is why martial arts in general are loved. I mean, everyone has their tenets. Taekwondo has a few different tenets, like honor and respect, and having an indomitable spirit and never like this perseverance idea. And sports in general can be admired for those reasons. I think people who are more invested in martial arts and then go on to understand about mixed martial arts as well tend to see this uh, level of investment and the way that you show these tenets a lot more closely. Whereas someone from the outside might not be able to see the amount of discipline, the amount of sacrifice, and the amount that people have gone through to train themselves to that kind of level. And therefore, someone on the outside really can't appreciate it because, well, they just don't know.
Yeah, they're just oblivious to the process that goes into it. So they just see uh loads of blood and whatnot. And to be honest, that's another thing. There's not a huge amount of fights that end in like the kind of bloodsheds that people associate cage fighting with. Um, like yes, it does happen and cuts happen, but is that a reason to be calling it a primitive pursuit? Like it's just at the end of the day, like it's just blood. Those guys are completely aware of what they're going into. They've had cuts many times. Um, and it's it's in my opinion, like I don't see anything primitive in what they do because I think that's the bad rep that it gets. But yeah, in terms of people loving it, it's absolutely those people who have really invested their time themselves into doing a martial art, and then you just the amount of work that goes into it is it's incredible. You know, those guys who are in the cage, they're some of the hardest workers, probably like full stop, for any profession. To be fair,
Well, yeah,
um,
I was just thinking the other day. I was like, just imagine all the people you know, the amount of work that gets put in, and these guys who you see as the champions in the sport, they are the best in the world at doing that. The best. How many people are there on the planet? How many people are there that train? And these people are the greatest at their sport.
yeah,
That is phenomenal. You know what though? You say that it's not a primitive sport. I kind of disagree. In a weird way, it is primitive, but in a non-insulting way. Because all right, me and you and people who practice martial arts love martial arts because we can see the really deep. We can see all the work that's behind it, all the different layers to it. But that's not why most people like cage fighting. Most people like cage fighting. Well, the reason it's so popular is because it's a sport that people who don't train it can understand. It's a sport that people who are complete novices can look at and appreciate. And the reason they can appreciate it is because it's so primitive and primal. And that's kind of how it brings us back to the gladiators and the old folk wrestlers and the fact that these sports have been real for a very long time. So it's kind of interesting that it's loved so widely because it's not because people are so skilled and it's not because people are so proficient at it. It's loved super widely because it's accessible to everyone. And I'm not really sure why that is.
yeah. No, I have to agree with you there. Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe what I was aiming at when I was saying it's not primitive is I don't know. Maybe I think people just have a weird perception that we have somehow as humans progressed so far that we should not be entertaining these sorts of sports and pursuits, which is to me a little bit silly. It's partly what makes us human. Is like we are still primal creatures, so we do have these desires to see those things, and we find them exciting. And I think it's also, it's the old sort of question of who's the stronger person, um, which is always sort of in the back of our minds. Um, and you see that being done in real time, in a cage. You want to see who the stronger guy is. You know, you see a guy like Francis Ngannou, absolute machine, going against Stipe Miocic, who is a fireman. You know, and like, yeah, he's a big guy, obviously, but like, you want to see that fight, and you, when you see Stipe win, you're like, holy shit, a fireman just beat like an absolute beast of an athlete.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess it's the whole this is part of what makes us human thing. That's why it's so popular and it's why it's so accessible. Because I think we spoke about this last time before we messed up the podcast months ago. Um, I always think that fighting is one of those few things that's so innately human. It
Yeah.
clearly is, because everyone around the world does it. It's not a cultural thing because every culture does it. It's not a location thing because everyone everywhere does it. Fighting is part of what makes us human in the same way that traveling is. Like, so last time I think we said about this again. It was an interesting thing I read. Maybe that some people think that Neanderthals weren't any less intelligent than us. They might not have even been worse at doing anything than us. They were stronger and tougher. But the difference is that Neanderthals didn't travel in the same way that we do, and we branched out and we spread out, and that led us to adapt to more environments. And when something local happened, we wouldn't die out. And it's what drives us now to go and travel and try and go. Well, people just want to travel, or people want to go to the moon or to Mars. It's something about being human, that we are nomads, that we are. Being human means we do want to go elsewhere, and I
Mhm.
think we shouldn't stand in the way of that. In the same way, I think that being human, we want to fight, we want to make art, we want to build societies, and we want to communicate. And it's just one of those innate things that makes us people. So
Yeah.
many people enjoy fighting, whether they should or they shouldn't, apparently, from about who they are. You get some very weird people who enjoy martial arts, and it's just one of those innate things. I don't know if there's good reason for it, but I don't think it's
uh,
ever going to go away.
I think when it gets, you know, the negative side of it, so the hate relationship that people have with fighting, I think it tends to be coming from a place that isn't genuine. Like, it's a place of like higher ground, like, I'm above this. uh why are people fighting? I'm so above this. And it's like, well, you know, this is a human thing. Like, it's, as you've said, it's an innately human experience. um that is why, like, no one's really above it. And of course, now it's an entertainment sport, right? It's become more of an entertainment business. um I guess the UFC has sort of popularized that, the sport as an entertainment thing, whereas, you know, something like WWE has always been entertainment, so that you can't really think about that. And well, I guess boxing has always been an entertainment,
Hmm.
as well as a sport. um but yeah, kind of lost my track of thought there.
Well, I think boxing is an interesting one, that it's been acceptable as a sport for so much longer. And before I say this, I'm not deriding boxing at all. It's a very complex and a very sophisticated sport. But at the same time, it's much easier to understand than something like judo or wrestling or mixed martial arts, because it's two guys throwing punches at each other. That's what it looks like.
Yeah.
I know that there's all the sophisticated parts behind it, but the reason it's so popular is because it seems accessible, and that's part of why it becomes really popular as a sport. Because
Yeah.
it's like we said before, it's about lack of perception. People need to understand what they're watching in order to understand that it's a complex sport, and in order to appreciate it. The reason boxing is so much popular, and so much more readily available, is because there is less education that has to happen before
Yeah.
before it's considered, before people can watch it as an easy sport. That's why it gets so much less hate than cage fighting, which you look at, and a lot of the time it looks like two guys brawling. But as you become more and more educated on this, on fighting in general, you'll see all the nuances involved, and that's part of what Jack Slack's done a little series on finding the art. That was a really interesting one because it takes scenarios that you'd look at and just see chaos normally, and will explain them to you so you can look at them and see the patterns and see the what is going on and suddenly be able to understand things on a whole nother level.
Yeah, I think. Do you know? I wonder if cage fighting. So, right, we keep calling it cage fighting. I wonder if the UFC started with a ring, if it would have got the same amount of hate as it did when it was a thing. And I wonder if the cage is like a psychological thing that people just think, oh, these guys are getting locked in a cage.
I think that was the idea of it in the first place. It was a shock factor.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I think that's what why they did it. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. But I wonder why. I wonder if it wasn't the case, if people would think of the sport differently.
I see what you're saying, but I don't think Pride ever got the same.
That's true. That that is a very good point. I take that 100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, Pride never got a good rep.
no, it didn't.
But that was, yeah, but that was like really uh really anything goes. And I think maybe that's when, because yeah, it's interesting, is you want to see people um have hand to hand combat, and the idea of mixed martial arts in a way is that sort of you're mixing all movements, but then people get a bit weird when like you have people you're kicking someone else on the floor, so there's still rules
They're right,
that
yeah, but
that people prefer.
again, though, I think it's a perception thing because the kicking people on the floor, okay, now and then it can be really bad, but I think most damage would occur from head kicks when people are standing. Most damage would occur from other movements that are still legal that weren't
Yeah.
before. Again, it's a perception and an education issue. And people, if they know that the floor strikes, maybe not soccer kicks, but like stomps and stuff, if people know that those aren't the most damaging things, and the downward elbow aren't the most damaging things, people get less shocked by them. And I think that's kind of where there's most ground to be made is with telling people, educating people in how it works in a really simple and easy to digest way, which is why
Yeah.
commentators like Joe Rogan are so popular because part of his angle is all about making sure that when people are watching it, they know what they're seeing. That's why he breaks down the grappling so much more. And I think I heard an interesting rule he gave himself was like he will never say something on the mic that he thinks his mum would be able to say, something like that. You know, he needs to say stuff so that people know what they're watching and people can appreciate what they're seeing so much better.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think if we just very quickly go back to the point on technicality, which you were saying with boxing, I think it's you're absolutely right that if things are simpler, people are more likely to be entertained by it. Because if you even if you look at kickboxing versus Muay Thai, people like on a general scale. I'm not talking about Thailand because that's obviously different,
Mm-hmm.
but people will more likely, well, have in the past watched K1 more than they will watch Muay Thai, because Muay Thai is more technical in a lot of ways. Or sorry, maybe just more complex. Like you have the clinch, you have the knees, the elbows, and so on. So I think that kind of draws people away, because a lot of the matches, right, you will obviously see like crazy knees and crazy elbows landing and people getting knocked out. But a lot of it is like heavy clinching, teeps, technical setups for sweeps and things like that.
And I think that's why things like it's maybe why judo, for example, is as I have seen it, tends to be more popular in the Olympics because than say wrestling, because despite them both being complicated, judo's easier to get.
Mm.
The bloke goes up, he slams on the floor, everyone knows what that's like. Wrestling is a whole lot more complicated, and though people can appreciate a pin, most of
Yeah,
the work is not done as a pin. The way to make these sports popular is for people to think that they know what they're looking at.
yeah, yeah. I think yeah, it's just education is part of it, and being or just awareness of the of the those different complex movements, definitely. But in terms from a standpoint of hating it, I do think it comes from a weird place of higher ground, that people have, that they think that they are above um, our human parts. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram under the name Combat Thoughts. We'll see you next time.